Hello and welcome back to the fourth episode of Japan Memo this year, the IISS Japan Chair Programme podcast. I'm Robert Ward, Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy here at the IISS. Here we're joined by experts, strategists and practitioners to analyse why Japan matters in today's regional and global geopolitical landscape. Today we're excited and delighted to welcome three wonderful guests, Professor Hosoya Yuichi, Professor Kuang Heng and Fenella McGerty, to discuss Japan-UK relations. Before we get into the discussion, I'd like to introduce our guests. Professor Hosoya Yuichi is Professor of International Politics at Keio University and Director of Keio Center for Strategy. He's also Director of Research at the Asia Pacific Initiative, API, in Tokyo. Yuichi has worked for the Japanese government, think tanks inside and outside Japan, and at a number of universities. His research interests include post-war international history, British diplomatic history, and Japanese foreign and security policy. His recent publications include co-edited books which were published in 2023. They are Modern Japan's Place in the World and The Transformation of the Liberal Order, Evolutions and Limitations. He's also contributed to one of our IISS Japan Chair Adelphi publications, Japan and the IISS Connecting Western and Japanese Strategic Thought from the Cold War to the War on Ukraine. Welcome, Yuichi.
Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction.
Our second guest is Kuang Heng, who is Professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy and Director of the Security Studies Unit at the Institute for Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo. Kuang has held faculty positions lecturing at universities in Ireland, Scotland and Singapore. He was also Senior Academic Visitor at the University of Cambridge in 2022 and at the LSE from 2023 to 2024. Current research interests include UK-Japan defence cooperation and Japan's engagement with European military deployments in the Indo-Pacific. His latest publications include a co-authored article looking under the hood of joint naval exercises, motives and perceived benefits for Japan. Welcome, Kuang.
Thanks very much, Robert. Delighted to be here.
And our third guest is our very own Fenella McGerty. Fenella is a Senior Fellow for Defence Economics in the Defence and Military Analysis Programme here at the IISS. She's responsible for defence economics research at the Institute and the relevant data presented in our flagship publication, Military Balance, in our database, Military Balance Plus, and other IISS publications. Fenella specialises in military expenditure analysis and forecasting. Before joining the IISS, Fenella worked at Jane's on the development of their defence economics portfolio and as a UK parliamentary researcher. Her recent publications include European Defence Funding Fiscal Manoeuvres, which is published for the IISS. This is Fenella's second appearance on Japan Memo following her contribution to the episode about Japan's new capitalism and defence budget back in 2023. Welcome back, Fenella.
Thank you, Robert. Great to be here. Thanks for having me again.
Japan-UK relations. Let's look at the diplomatic side of the relationship first. In recent years, ties between Japan and the UK have grown significantly stronger. For example, there was the announcement by the UK of its Indo-Pacific tilt in 2021, which marked a major strategic shift for the UK towards Asia. And this was followed by the signing of the bilateral Hiroshima Accord back in 2023. More recently, there was the state visit by Their Majesties the Emperor and Empress of Japan in 2024. All of this sort of symbolised, A, the UK's interest in Asia and B, growing partnership between Japan and the UK. I'll start with you, Yuichi, if I may. How do you think Japan-UK diplomatic relations have evolved in recent years? And in what ways has the Ishiba administration continued or adapted this diplomatic trajectory?
Thank you for the question. First of all, I feel that the UK-Japan relations have never so strong and never so friendly. And there must be several reasons for this. Number one, currently we see that the United States global leadership becomes much less predictable and much less certain. For these reasons, I think that we need to enhance our political collaboration between Japan and the UK together with other like-minded partners, in addition to maintaining a strong alliance relationship with the United States. And also, secondly, nowadays, liberal democracy become a minority in the international community, while the authoritarian regimes such as China and Russia are becoming more influential. In this way, I think that both Japan and the UK really need to collaborate each other. But at the same time, unlike previous prime ministers like Shinzo Abe and Yoshihide Suga and Fumio Kishida, before he became prime minister, some experts in Japan presented some doubts about Ishiba's foreign policy stance because he had been quite critical to previous prime minister's foreign policy. So we expected that Prime Minister Ishiba would perhaps present a quite radically new foreign policy course, which would perhaps undermine some of the stability in our relationship with our closest security partners. But so far, having seen his records, we now think that Prime Minister Ishiba has maintained quite traditionalist Japanese foreign policy course, maintaining a very strong Japan's alliance with the United States together with its very close friendly relationship with Japan's strategic partners such as the UK.
Some people are saying that Japan-UK relations are the best that they've been since the Anglo-Japanese alliance, 1902 to 1923. Do you think that's right?
More than that, I think that as a historian, I feel that the current UK-Japan relations is stronger than the time of the UK-Japan alliance, because at that time, UK showed some doubts about Japan's strong internationalist ideology. At that time, both sides, Japan and the UK, didn't have a very strong mutual trust. So it's a kind of a marriage of convenience. Both sides needed each other, but I don't think that there existed very strong trust between the two countries. But nowadays, we can say that both Japan and the UK have much stronger trust and mutual understanding. And these trust and mutual understanding actually creates much stronger tie between the two countries.
Post-Brexit foreign policy, as I said at the beginning, has put increasing emphasis on the UK's engagement with the Indo-Pacific. And the Labour government, which took office in July 2024, seems much longer ago now, actually, less than a year at this recording anyway, has largely maintained the strategic posture set by the previous Conservative government. And despite concerns that the UK may prioritise rebuilding ties with the EU and strengthening other relationships, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has reaffirmed the UK's commitment to its Indo-Pacific strategy. So Fenella, thinking about the UK side, and obviously in your past, you worked in Parliament as a researcher, so perhaps you have some sort of insights here. How do you think the UK's Indo-Pacific diplomatic strategy is developing under Prime Minister Starmer?
Thanks, Robert. Yes, I think, of course, there were really strong concerns that were very vocal and loud about strong election message of closer ties with Europe and NATO first strategy coming through from Keir Starmer's Labour government. And that might mean some form of retreat from the very real progress that had been made between UK and Indo-Pacific relations under the previous Conservative government. What we've been seeing now is a realization that that messaging happened, and the UK is now being increasingly vocal about the measures that have been undertaken under this government in engagement in the region. So in terms of how we got to where we are, we had the Indo-Pacific tilt under the Conservative government, and there were various achievements outlined under that. And then we had the 2023 refresh of the integrated review that was essentially saying we've achieved a lot of things, now we're moving into a sustainment phase. And there were some criticisms at the time that because of how tight things are fiscally in the UK, that we couldn't afford to potentially do more, that we're not actually able to even protect our country and our regional interests closer to home. The concern was that the new Labour government would start to retreat from this because there's just no money to continue such things. Commitments have been reaffirmed. We've seen diplomatic trips to the region continue, strategic engagements renewed. The CSG-25 embarked last month in Operation High Mast, which will be headed to the Indo-Pacific following exercises and operations in the Mediterranean. So that's the second carrier strike group deployment, following on from the one about 4 years ago under the previous government. So there is that sense of continuation, that sense of not reneging or pulling back. Major programs like GCAP and AUKUS are proceeding, and we've seen progress on them all. And that deployment is a strong signal of the UK's commitment to the region, but it's also significant in the context of multi-carrier, multinational operations. It's really key for the UK to do this as well. It's coordinated European efforts, and it's really about boosting the naval presence in the Indo-Pacific as well. But I think even before that major signal, we did have a statement from the UK MOD Defence Minister John Healey emphasising the deployment of hundreds of UK Armed Forces personnel to take part in a series of operations towards the tail end of last year. Indo-Pacific Minister Catherine West also spoke in November last year that the region was crucial to the UK for 3 reasons: boosting economic growth, tackling climate change, and strengthening national and global security. So it's this balanced approach where the engagement that we have had on the defence side is also really crucial to supporting the ongoing economic cooperation as well. I think we will have a bit more clarity on Labour's approach to the region in terms of defence and security in the upcoming Strategic Defence Review, the SDR. I think it's imminent at this point. I keep getting told it's going to be tomorrow, then the next day, but it does seem imminent. Potentially, my final point, just one area of concern, is that the original regional tilt did include the use of the UK foreign aid budget to support objectives in the region. And obviously, with the increase that we've had announced for defence under the Labour government towards 2.5% of GDP by 2027, that required an international aid cut of 0.2% of GNP. So that does rather limit that avenue of the tilt and the negotiation going forward. So it's more shifting towards the concrete programmes and the ongoing strategies that have been announced so far.
You said in your comments that all this activity, the Carrier Strike Group and so on, you said that was key for the UK to keep it all going. What did you mean by that? Could you elaborate a bit?
More just that in the UK, undertaking such operations and exercises are really key for our armed forces personnel as well. It's key for European cooperation because in the previous deployment, other countries are involved. In this one, we've got Canada and Norway, and it's a real exercise for the UK to undertake to show basically the extent to which these capabilities have been developed, their effectiveness. While it is that symbol of the UK's commitment to the region, there's benefits to the UK as well. So it's a definite positive, and the reason that the UK would undertake such a thing is because there is benefits all round in terms of interoperability and multilateral operations in Europe as well.
Sort of win-win, as Xi Jinping might say.
Could I just jump in on some of the points that were raised by Hosoya Sensei and also Fenella? I agree with Yuichi that there's a high degree of continuity from Kishida to Ishiba. And we see that also in the rhetoric, the phrases that Ishiba deploys. And he talks about how the Indo-Pacific and what happens in Ukraine is inseparable. Those are exact terms that Kishiba deployed. And he also uses the same phrases to explain Japan's position on China, saying that Japan will say what needs to be said and do what needs to be done with regards to China. So that's a high level of continuity, I think. And I think that comforts some of the people who were a bit skeptical about what he might do. The other thing I would also add is the incredibly high level of trust between the UK and Japan is also very closely reflected in the joint statements that they issue every time after the high-level leaders summit. And you see this consistent usage of this particular phrase that Japan and UK are the closest partners in Asia and Europe. And we see that always repeated, regardless of the administration in power. So I think that's quite comforting for us to watch how the relationship has really strengthened despite transitions of power on both sides. Just following up on Fenella's point, I think when the Labour administration first came into power, initially, there was a bit of a wobble with concerns in Japan over commitment to GCAP. And the Labour administration seemed to be much more forthcoming on endorsing AUKUS, but for some reason were relatively silent on GCAP. And this created, I think, a bit of anxiety on the part of Japan, whether the new administration would be supportive of GCAP. Defense Minister Nakatani actually went to London quite soon afterwards and was very glad to receive reassurance from Defense Secretary John Healey. So I think that wobble is still potentially there, but it's been smoothed over recently, thankfully, and we'll see what comes out in the SDR later this month, hopefully.
Given the Labour government's focus on growth agenda, GCAP activity is good for those bits of the country that are involved in it. So one would hope that commitment to it would be definitely forthcoming. Good points there. Narrowing down the focus a little bit to Japan-UK economic relations, it struck me, I was looking at comments made by some senior Japanese figures immediately after Brexit and in the run-up to sort of the enactment of Brexit. And there was a lot of gloom about UK-Japan relations post-Brexit for obvious reasons, given that Japanese investments in the UK were so large and they're worried about the impact on activities between the UK and the EU. But since then, economic relations sort of seem to have changed and deepened in a sense. And building on these diplomatic developments, Japan and the UK have been, I think, working quite hard to strengthen their economic ties. There was the UK-Japan Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, CEPA, the UK's accession, of course, to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Mega Trade Bloc CPTPP, which happened at the end of 2024. And of course, we've just had the UK-Japan Economic 2+2. A question for Yuichi first, please. How do you think Japan and the UK can work together to sort of lead efforts to maintain and promote the free and open international economic order, particularly given all the turbulence that we have coming out of the US at the moment with tariffs and so on?
UK's accession to the CPTPP was extremely warmly welcomed by the majority of Japanese people for some reasons. Number one, the United States has never so hostile to the idea of free trade. In this way, it is much less likely that the United States government under President Trump would enter into the CPTPP. Without the United States, I think that UK can play a very important role in the region because both Japan and the UK are, number one, the closest ally to the United States. So we are not making a hostile trade bloc to the United States, number one. Number two, still, the two leading liberal democracies, I mean the Japan and the UK, can play a leading role in creating and defending quite a solid free trade bloc in the region, defending the idea of free trade based on the rule of law. So in this way, I think that by having the UK, the CPTPP can have much important influence in the global trade. Together with these, I also like to say that Indo-Pacific region now becomes the most prosperous and important dynamic region when we think about an international economy. I think that it is a good thing for both Japan and UK to become a shaper of the region rather than the region would be shaped by China or Russia. So in this way, I think that UK and Japan have so many things in common in creating a quite important free and open international economic order in the Indo-Pacific region.
A follow-on question. I mean, Japan is used to operating in the Asia Pacific. Japan's obviously part of the region and has a long history of economic engagement. How do you think that the Japanese government would like the UK to behave in the CPTPP to achieve its broader strategic goals? Because CPTPP isn't just about selling stuff. There's also a strategic meaning to it. Do you have any thoughts on how Tokyo's thinking about this?
In that region, the Indo-Pacific region, smaller powers, particularly in Southeast Asian region, they don't like to see that regional cooperation would be shaped by simply great powers. We have to care about domestic politics as well as the sensitivities of those smaller powers. Japan has been, in this way, supporting for decades the idea of ASEAN centrality. ASEAN centrality must be always at the center of regional cooperation in the region. Otherwise, big powers such as the United States or China are going to shape the regional order. By supporting the idea of the ASEAN centrality, Japan now becomes quite trustworthy partner to the country in the Southeast Asia. And at the same time, I think that there are so many different ideologies and political regimes, religions, and so on. Pluralist idea would be much more welcome than the European integration. Japan and the UK can play a leading role by defending the idea of ASEAN centrality, number one, by caring the domestic politics or the sensitivity of each those small and medium-sized powers. At the same time, I think that in that region, they don't like to see that China is seen as an enemy to the region. ASEAN relies heavily upon the Chinese market and its trade with China. That's why I think that many countries in the region would welcome more or less quite constructive cooperative relationship with China. So this is a quite different approach to the region, unlike what the United States government is doing in the region.
Kuang, I can see you nodding there. Do you want to come in?
Just thinking about Prime Minister Ishiba's recent trips during the Golden Week holiday. I mean, he's just been to Vietnam for the second time since he came into office. And it's a very clear indicator of Japan, as Hosoya mentioned earlier, reaching out to ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries, trying to re-emphasize that Japan very much respects ASEAN centrality, but also emphasizing the message that Japan can work together with these countries that all have benefited from free trade. So upholding the rules-based system as well. So Southeast Asia is increasingly important for Japan's strategy in the region, especially in the age of Trump's tariffs.
And the UK and Japan both have ASEAN dialogue partner status as well. So, which I'm not sure the UK has been that active in using its status, but perhaps that will change. Stick with you, Kuang, for a moment. I mentioned the economic 2+2 that took place in March, and that's for Japan, I think the only economic 2+2 outside the one that it already has with the US. So it was quite a big statement of, again, this thing we've been talking about, trust in the bilateral relationship with the UK. I was looking at the readout from it, the sort of 4 pillars of cooperation: economic security, energy security, upholding rules-based order in trade, as we've just been talking about, and then engagement with the global south. Thinking about economic security, though, for a moment, particularly in relation to China, which we've just been mentioning, Yi Kuang, how do you think that Japan and the UK can effectively strengthen their cooperation in economic security?
You're absolutely right, Robert, that the economic 2+2 was really quite significant for Japan, but also very significant for the UK, because I think it's the first ever for the UK to have economic 2+2 with any partner. The very fact that Japan and the UK decided to have that framework, I think it's quite a significant move in bilateral economic relations. I think in terms of how both parties conceptualize economic security, I think there's a bit of a nuanced difference in how they position defense within the industrial strategy. So I was just looking at the press release that was published by the UK before the talk. That press release highlighted how, exactly as you said, UK-Japan defense industrial cooperation on GCAP had provided, quote, jobs for Brits. Right? It's very clear focus, right, on the economic benefits that defense industrial cooperation provides. However, this element was not prominent in the joint UK-Japan press release issued after the talks. And instead, as you said, the focus was more on things like supply chains, clean energy, and export controls. So I think if you look at, say, the UK's 2024 defense industrial strategy, we have Defense Secretary John Healey very clearly emphasizing that the defense sector should be the engine for jobs and growth in the UK economy. So the linkage between defense and jobs, and economic growth more broadly, is very clear in the UK, but it's not so clear in Japan, relatively speaking. Mm-hmm. And there are some observers, for example, in the International Security Industry Council in Japan, who note that there is a so-called, quote, GCAP silence, where the companies involved remain relatively wary of raising public awareness of their involvement in defense-related projects. Now, this is slowly changing. It's still this mindset that still needs to be worked on.
GCAP silence from companies in Japan involved in it.
So there was this discussion about whether there should be more proactive PR events to raise awareness within Japanese public in general, and also about the defense industrial contribution to GCAP. The feedback received from the companies involved apparently was really quite lukewarm and quite disappointing, right, to the organizers who wanted to raise the profile of the project, and also, of course, trying to highlight the benefits that the Japanese economy can actually gain in terms of jobs and training of skilled engineers and all the rest of it. These are things that are slowly changing in the Japanese defense industry, but still that the mindset is still a lingering issue to look at.
Let's stick with GCAP and move to Japan-UK defense relationship. Fenella, you've also mentioned GCAP in your remarks. GCAP initiative is Japan's first military jet development program that doesn't have the involvement of Japan's only treaty ally, the US. So obviously it's historic in that respect. We hope that GCAP accelerates military cooperation between the UK, Japan, and Italy, and also represents a deepening of Japan's strategic ties with Europe. But how specifically do you see that the project can further strengthen Japan-UK defense relations, particularly given the sort of, again, the background noise around worries about the US's commitment to its overseas commitments?
The GCAP programme fits alongside the recent progress that we've had on Japan and UK defence cooperation, the signing of the Reciprocal Access Agreement in 2023, so UK and Japan can deploy forces in each other's countries, rapidly accelerate defence and security cooperation, really just opening the doors towards greater interaction. That was described as the most important defence treaty between the two countries for over 100 years by the UK government. So it's how seriously it was taken at the time as well. And given the UK was the first European country to have such an agreement, was really key as well. And it did, alongside the GCAP programme, enable that conversation and the stronger defence ties to continue and place things on a stronger footing as we did get into this more contested and uncertain place, not just in terms of economic security, but also wider defence and security issues now presented by the US's stance on its position globally. I think the GCAP program itself is a huge undertaking, but the framework agreement where you have the headquarters in the UK, that the first CEO of the government delivery organisation will be from Japan, and the equivalent industry organisation will be Italian. That's a good example of how a program can be constructed and divided effectively among partners. Risk is inherent in developing advanced combat aircraft generally. Doing so in collaboration does add a layer of complexity that can compound the challenge. It does seem to be being managed well so far among the partners, but I think the greatest concern with GCAP is the ambitious schedule to deliver the first production standard aircraft by 2035. That's a very challenging target. I think BAE Systems at the time said that meeting it would require developing the core platform in half the amount of time that it had taken for programs like the F-35 and Typhoon. So they're going to be mobilizing the private sector more and looking at different savings that can be made in terms of development. But I think we've seen the program gather some momentum. We've seen the GCAP International Government Organization agreement in December 2023, and then the industry partner agreement a year later, signing off on the joint venture for the program. It's really interesting in terms of the messaging. I found that very interesting, what you were saying, Kuang, about how in Japan, the industrial benefits are not being perhaps communicated as strongly as they are in the UK. In the UK, it can be quite often the only way to get the consensus and agreement upon a policy. So when the UK defence budget was increased at the expense of international aid, it was made very clear that defence is very much part of the UK's prosperity agenda, that defence benefits not just London and the South East, it's the whole of the country that would benefit from greater defence spending as it permeates through. So not just GCAP, but the entire industry. We're seeing that message being pushed a lot across Europe because it's such a tight fiscal space that these increases for defence are happening, that the only way to make them tenable to the electorate is to promote that defence industrial benefit, the jobs, the wider spin-offs, technology, incorporating the innovation from the private sector, everything like that has been really emphasised, because otherwise the attitudes towards ever increasing defence are just going to turn more and more negative in Europe without that messaging as well. But in terms of GCAP, recent analysis on the programme argues that what's going to be key to both the government and industrial organisation is their capacity to decision make and not have to defer to the respective national structures. Arguably, the lack of empowerment on previous programmes that were cross-collaborative meant that there were delays to the programme, increased costs. So it's the level of empowerment that these organisations have to not be restricted by the national infrastructure's procurement systems that are ultimately quite flawed. And I think the success of the programme is going to hinge on the management of things like the unit price to determine the export success. And there are very real funding constraints in all three partners to varying degrees. I think the UK's deficit around 4.4% of GDP, and that is projected to close, but we're looking at significant fiscal reform. We're looking at other public spending cuts because we have these fiscal rules of the Labour government coming through. Italy's finances, we also have a deficit beyond that 3% of GDP. That's well above the 60% of GDP cap as well. And even though the EU is loosening fiscal rules, it will be a case of whether Italy undertakes that opportunity to increase deficit and debt levels for defence without incurring penalties across the EU. And I think in Japan, we have seen really significant moves to bolster defence spending. But there are obviously economic difficulties in Japan as well. And we're looking at rebuilding fiscal buffers, ensuring debt sustainability through the raising of key taxes from April next year, in part to fund the increases for defence as well. So it's how that messaging comes through and how these countries are able to continue financing defence as well is going to be really key, because the programme costs of GCAP and other defence priorities in these countries are just going to increase. Even with that growth in the short term, that significant distinct shift in Japanese policy, it may be that more is needed, and there may be greater pressure from President Trump to implement further increases as well. So there's that pressure coming through. So I think there are inherent risks, but given that Italy and the UK have had a fairly bruising experience on the Eurofighter programme, they can draw lessons from it, attempt to avoid replicating the issues that came in the past. And Japan as a partner brings to the plate really core capabilities, great programme management and things like that. So there's sort of lessons from both sides that can be pulled into it. And I think as the programme develops, greater industrial ties are made, it does lay the groundwork for future cooperation, future collaborative programmes, but it all hinges on the success. And as I say, there are considerable risks And its success is actually crucial for the future of relations. It's such a big program that the ultimate success of it or otherwise would actually damage not just defence relations, but economic potentially as well. The Labour government was stronger on AUKUS and said, this is, our firm commitment, ironclad, Ukraine, everything. And then GCAP just wasn't mentioned in the manifestos or anything. But then I think under examination and looking at it, even though it is a very expensive programme and a very ambitious one, I think the decision was ultimately realised that commitment was needed, because ultimately what else is the UK going to do in terms of developing its fighter programme? Unless the German Franco programme collapses, the UK's options, this is the main one.
You were saying, Fenella, at the beginning there, the importance of defence spending, the increases in defence spending, and the way the government in the UK and probably in Europe is attaching that to the prosperity agenda, growth agenda. Yuichi, you know the Japanese government under various prime ministers very well. Can you see a situation in which the Japanese government starts to portray higher defence spending as an important tool for prosperity? Because it does seem to be an obvious political link to make. If you've got to spend more money on defence, you want to bring the population with you.
Yes, for Japan, both strategic autonomy and stronger alliance relationship with the United States are both needed to create Japan's strategic autonomy and to create much stronger alliance relationship with the United States. In both cases, I think that larger defense spending is actually needed. Japanese prime minister and maybe future prime ministers, as long as they feel that Japan needs both strategic autonomy and or stronger alliance relationship with the United States to defend Japanese people, to defend Japanese soil. I think that in any way, Japan needs larger defense spending. This is in theory, a majority of Japanese people are willing to accept. The point is, to what extent Japanese voters are willing to increase Japanese taxation. Without taxation, there is clear limits. And the current prime minister and the government is saying that so far, we don't need any additional taxation for this increased defense spending. But of course, there is a clear limits. So the next step is the German government actually did recently. Japanese government and prime minister should be more honest in explaining to the Japanese voters that the current strategic situation surrounding Japan is much, much more difficult than we previously expected. In this way, maybe we need to have much radical method to strengthen and to increase our defense spending.
And sticking with money, Fenella said at the beginning that there isn't much money to go around. Kuang, you've been looking at European military commitments in the Indo-Pacific and so on. Given the financial constraints on the UK and on the Japanese side, as Yuichi was saying, how realistic is it that the UK can sustain its commitment to the Indo-Pacific defence as security theatre, particularly given all the concerns now about Ukraine's longer-term security, given that we've got this change of administration in the US?
That's the billion-pound question, I suppose. How do you maintain persistent presence and deterrence in a resource-challenged environment? We are all faced with the same challenges. If we look at what the British Army has done over several years now, it's been engaged in relatively small-scale annual bilateral land exercises, the Vigilant Isles exercises held on Japanese territory. These are relatively small-scale, probably don't cost that much, but it enables the UK to exercise very high-end scenarios with Japanese ground self-defense force on an annual basis. And for many years, the UK was the only European power to do that on Japanese territory and the first non-US military force to do that until the French in December last year also held their first land exercise in Japanese territory. The scale of British commitment is relatively small, but it can be sustainable in this particular context with the Vigilant Isles exercise. The other thing I would point to is the two forward-deployed offshore patrol vessels that have been operating in the Indo-Pacific since 2021, HMS Spey and HMS Tamar. These are not as high profile as the CSG-21, CSG-25, but they are much more sustainable. The crews are rotated every 6 months. They don't have a permanent base. They just go around the region, most notably supplying in Singapore and also in Japan. So these logistics stops are really enablers, very critical enablers for relatively small-scale presence to be sustainable over the 5-year mission that it's been given. the UK's power in terms of bringing together multiple partners and allies. CSG-21, you had Queen Elizabeth, the aircraft carrier, bringing along multiple European partners. The Dutch contributed an air defense frigate, the US contributed a Navy destroyer, the US Marines contributed a squadron of F-35s. And this time, CSG-25, actually, the Royal Navy is supplying fewer ships than CSG-21 the last time round, but it brings convening power again in the form of two Norwegian vessels, a Norwegian frigate and a supply ship, a Spanish frigate, and along the way, a New Zealand and Canadian frigate will join up at various points. The UK also brings that quite important convening power to the Indo-Pacific. Let's not forget also the cooperation that UK has with France. UK and France have practiced jointly long-range deployment of air power from Europe all the way to Australia through a bilateral exercise called Griffin Strike. UK and France have also been coordinating the sequencing of the CSG deployments towards the Indo-Pacific. So the French CSG was in the region earlier this year, and we're going to see the UK CSG coming over later this year. So that sequencing, I think, also allows for a more regular European carrier presence, even though we are all operating in really resource-constrained environments.
I was reading the other day that a skeptic was writing about, in reality, these two countries are too weak to do much. The mood music is very positive, but actually, given the big tectonic plates that are sort of shifting in the world, China, Russia, US, and so on. Yuichi, you're a historian by first love, I suspect. Do you agree with that? I'm expecting you don't, but how do you assess that particular assessment?
I largely agree with that. But on the other hand, from the sense of vulnerability, two sides are coming closer. If the UK is strong enough, I don't think that UK needs to come closer to Japan. Like the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902, UK became much more vulnerable in facing more various enemies in the region, like Germany, Imperial Russia, and France, and so on. That's why Japan, at the time in 1902, out of the sense of the vulnerability, UK decided to have an alliance in Japan. So in this way, I think that both sides, Japan and UK, have much stronger sense of vulnerability in facing like a giant, like United States and China, and Russia is becoming much more aggressive in the region. So these cannot be met unilaterally by either Japan or UK. So in this way, I think it would be correct to say that both Japan and the UK are positioned in a very weak place. Japan is still strong enough in some viewpoints because like Japan has F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, Japan has several important Aegis ships system, and Japan has a missile defense system. It means that Japan actually has the most cutting-edge defense equipment, and at the same time, Japan has a variety of strategic security partnership with nearly all the like-minded partners like Australia and ROK as well, and also India and France, UK, of course, Germany. In many ways, I think that more than before, with these security cooperation, Japan is placed in a much better place because before 1945, Japan was much more isolated, even with such a very strong military might. Because of the isolation, because of the much less reliable security partnership, Japan was defeated in 1945. Today, the situation is totally different. Japan has so many security partners, alliance relationship, and also Japan now decides to be stronger in the defense term. In this way, I think that it is a good thing for both Japan and the UK to be closer, having a sense of vulnerability in a difficult time.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of our UK-Japan relations discussion and takes us to our Japan memo questions. And we ask all of our guests the same two questions, and we always get some wonderful answers. So I'm looking forward to your answers too. And the questions are, do you have any book recommendations for listeners who want to understand Japan better? And the second question is, what do you think people often get wrong about Japan. So, Fenella, apologies. This is the second time that you're doing these Japan memo questions. But shall we start with you, please?
Sure, thanks, Robert. At the moment, I'm enjoying reading the contest for Japan's economic future, Entrepreneurs versus Corporate Giants by Richard Gatz, not least because I've been examining this issue a lot in Europe, looking at different ways of the evolving defense innovation ecosystem and the roles that the different parts of the industry play. It's interesting for me to understand how this dynamic works in Japan, what the unique challenges are there, and what's the same as what Europe's facing as well.
Quick question to the point you just made. What do you think the problem from your reading? What do you think the problems are that Japan faces?
I think it's a question of coordination and messaging as well, where you have those established defense companies. And I mean, I'm always focused on defense, but I think it's endemic across the established companies and the role that they play in fostering innovation and building up the entrepreneurial spirit, whether they encourage it or indeed stifle it. So it's how they play their part within the ecosystem. And it's been interesting to see what these companies have been doing. It's a question of resilience as well to help your supply chain and find different avenues of investment, especially in this very constrained time. I think the issues that the UK is facing in terms of shortened supply chains, inflation, fiscal difficulties, there's similarities in Japan as well. And it's been interesting to see the approaches that Japan takes.
And what do you think people get wrong about Japan?
Really, from a defense economics perspective, the 2% of GDP target, that there is some security spending in there as well. And Europe does this too, where it's not just defense, it's defense and a bit of security. So I think where the message is out there that Japan will spend 2% of GDP on defense by 2027, there have been significant increases for defense. There is that bolstering of funding, but it does need to be considered that there are wider elements in there, as there are in Europe. So it's a question of transparency as well.
Interesting. Thank you. Kuang, what book recommendations do you have? And I forgot to say you are allowed to recommend your own books as well. So apologies, I missed that out. What book recommendations and what do you think people get wrong?
I'm going to suggest NHK documentary series called Project X. It's subtitled The Challengers, which aired in early 2000s, recently revived last year as inevitably called Shin Project X. So each episode is really interesting. It features how a major challenge was tackled in Japan, such as, how do you restore Shuri Castle in Naha after it got burnt down, or how Japan built its first ever domestic civilian airliner, the YS-11. On a personal note, it also features a cracking ending song from Nakajima Miyuki, one of the very few songs that I unfortunately tried to attempt in karaoke sessions very poorly, I must add. So that would be my recommendation.
Excellent. And what do you think people get wrong about Japan?
There's a widespread impression that Japan is a pacifist country, but there's also a certain amount of interest in the military, not just in hardcore military nerds, the Gunji otaku, but more generally in the wider population. For example, if you went to the ground self-defense forces, the Higashi Fuji, firepower demonstration, when it used to be open to the public, all the tickets will be oversubscribed many times over. And nowadays, if you go to open days at base events, you expect massive crowds, right? So last year, I was at the Iruma Air Base for the Aviation Festival Open Day. There were an estimated 150,000 people squeezed into the base. People were there watching, the Blue Impulse acrobatic display, all sorts of flying displays and even the static displays as well. And, all the paraphernalia, caps and, model planes of F-15s and F-35s all sold out. That gives us a different dimension, right, to look at what Japan is really about. Of course, it's a pacifist country, but there is also this underlying interest in the self-defense force and also in the military matters as well.
Thank you. Yuichi.
Thank you very much. May I recommend two books? 2 years ago, I published a co-edited book entitled Modern Japan's Place in World History from Meiji to Reiwa, as Robert kindly introduced in the beginning of this session. And the reason why I recommend this book is, number one, you can download this book for free. This book is based upon the newest research by Japanese historian. So I think that you can find many, many new findings as well as some of the new fresh perspectives about modern Japanese history. And another book I likely recommend is recently published by a Japanese famous legendary journalist, Yuichi Funabashi. He published a Japanese language biography about Shinzo Abe. And the name is Shukumei no Ko, Child of Fate. And maybe, Robert, you have it and you have read it. And this is a huge book, but still, there are so many amazing findings. That book shows that Yuichi Funabashi is truly a first-rate journalist, number one. Number two, he has spent perhaps nearly 10 years of his own research. In addition to having met with Shinzo Abe nearly 10 times for that, in addition to that, he has met nearly all the important cabinet ministers, officials, and so on. The book is amazing in the sense that the author spent a huge amount of time to create it.
Sheila Smith also recommended it at the end of last year in a podcast, but it is, as you say, Yuichi, it's an extraordinary achievement.
One of the biggest questions that Yuichi Funabashi has had is why Japanese politics actually face so many difficulties when it faces serious problems. And he found that because of the weakness in its political foundation. So any prime minister needs to have a strong political foundation. Shinzo Abe actually created the strongest political foundation in the ruling party and the government as well. Yoichi Funabashi wanted to know how Shinzo Abe created such a strong political foundation. And without having a strong political foundation, any Japanese prime minister can face difficulty in showing and presenting a strong political leadership. In this way, I think that Shinzo Abe could present a very strong political leadership with its strong political foundation.
And what do you think people get wrong about Japan, Yuichi?
Many people often assume that Japan is not independent enough as a sovereign state in international affairs, but I think it's wrong. When I research on the voting behaviors of Japan within the United Nations General Assembly, among all the American allies, Japan actually is ranked the second in voting differently from the United States after the Philippines. Japan actually voted differently from the United States much, much more than how both the UK and France actually voted. In the case of Palestinian question as well as the nuclear weapons abolishment, and also together with some of the issues relating to Asia, I think Japan actually voted differently from the American vote. So in this way, I think that for many decades, even though Japan actually did it quite quietly, trying to not infuriate Japan's most important alliance partner, even though Japan actually does it quite quietly, but in many occasions, Japan actually voted, and also Japan presented its policy differently from the United States. But because of the success of Japanese government officials, quite a quiet approach, it's not seen as such an independent actor in international affairs.
Interesting. That's a statistic I didn't know. So thank you for enlightening us, Yuichi. Well, that brings us to the end of this session. So thank you so much, Yuichi, Kuang, and Fenella. Incredibly rich discussion. We think we covered a lot of ground here. So big thanks from all of us on the podcast team. Please do follow Yuichi, Kuang, and Fenella on X or Twitter or LinkedIn, and the details of how to do this will be on show notes to this podcast. And thank you, as always, to our listeners for joining us on another episode of Japan Memo. If you have any comments or feedback, please contact us with your thoughts by email at japanchair@iiss.org. Japan Chair is all one word. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Japan Memo on the podcast platform of your choice. For more insightful analysis, I encourage you to look at past research from the Japan Chair programme and the IISS more broadly on our website. Thanks again, wonderful guests, and see everybody next time. Goodbye.